Welcome to this seminar on managing financial stress and restructuring in higher education from Evershen's offices at 1 Wood Street in London, in the centre of the city.
My cup's generally half full, so hopefully I'll bring a little bit of that. I mean, I think most of the risks have probably been talked about, so I'm not going to dwell on those. Most of the things that I'd written down I think have been covered already. So I'll just go over them at a very high level just to kind of remind ourselves of some of the things that we talked about. And I've got one or two others. You know, so the Auger report clearly is on everybody's mind. In the next couple of months, hopefully, we'll know what is said, and we'll be able to start to think about what that is. But picking up on James's point, you know, let's you know, make hay while the sun shines, you know, or fix the roof while the sun shines, rather than waiting until it's too late. I sometimes joke when I go to see clients with James and the team that when they walk into the room, you know it's bad news. You need to have brought somebody in much earlier than that, and to kind of help think this through. So I think there's something around just being prepared, and I touched a moment ago on some of the sort of the noise coming out from Wonk and others around what might be in the Auger report. I think some of the other things, of course, is Brexit, and again, we've talked about that a little bit as well, not just in terms of what the immigration policy for Europe might be and what that might mean for students, but how that will knock on to the rest of the world. Not just in actual policy, but actually how that is interpreted by other countries. And we've already seen over the last couple of years, countries like Australia and Canada being very vocal about how open their door is compared to, say, the UK or the USA. So I think we have to think about that as well. And of course, the role of staff, access to research funding, partnerships, etc. All of these things, I think, are creating, I've said this before, I think in 2011, a perfect storm, but there is definitely a large storm brewing somewhere over Europe or the mid-Atlantic. And then we've got the question of an election, which could happen any time after the 11th of this month through to the next 4 years. And what that might mean, the difference in terms of policy, as far as we can tell from the different parties, and what that might mean for higher education. You know, Labour's last manifesto clearly scrapping fees. Will that be in the next manifesto as well? And then the revolving door of HE ministers and keeping abreast of all of that. I think this is the third one since my summer holidays, probably. You know, and again, a very different individual to the last one. So we've got sort of local politics as well as sort of European politics on mind. And then I think the other one that we probably haven't really touched on is this ongoing changing expectations of all of the stakeholders around higher education. So students, increasingly challenging, demanding, much more support from the regulator than they had probably up until the creation of the OFS, but also employers and employers' needs. And I touched earlier on the fourth industrial revolution, the change in skill sets that we're going to need, and the extent to which, I mean, James, you touched on it briefly in terms of the offer. You know, are universities keeping pace in terms of the offer for what employers and what students need? One of the things I'm very mindful of when I left university, you know, one expected to get a job. Increasingly, I think young people are expecting to create their own jobs, to be employers. So entrepreneurship and the role that universities play in creating the opportunity for new businesses to be grown and evolved and developed from within the own institution, not just as a research spin out, but actually from students as well. So this all sounds quite sort of pessimistic, and I just thought we'd try and finish the conversation with some of the, well, what might it mean if we do the planning when we're at the top of the curve, or as we start to recognise the stress test. I think that you know, I think that there are still big opportunities for international partnerships. I'm not sure that just creating campuses overseas is necessarily the right thing for every institution, but certainly if we look to China, if we look to India, if we look to the sort of the nations where the economies are really growing, you know, there are growing middle classes, there are growing needs for skills, and we've been involved with a number of universities over the last 12 months where there have been some really exciting opportunities on the ground to bring the IP of UKHE to help create and grow new institutions or nascent institutions in China and India, for example. What else have we got? I think the other area that we've seen quite a lot of is universities not just looking at the cost base, which I think they've been doing for quite some time, but also looking at income. So how do you diversify your income streams? How do we make sure we're not just relying on these EU students who, if they disappear tomorrow, that's our reserves gone, but actually starting to think about other routes. And the apprenticeship initiative and higher level degree apprenticeships, I think, is an area that is starting to get some traction. You know, there's a B2B play there around if I've got to find 100 students through UCAS one by one versus 100 students through a B2B relationship with a large employer, you know, 100 to 1. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. And as you say, I think if you start to think about mergers and long before there's an insolvency challenge, that starts to become interesting. You know, I think I read it in the paper quite recently, you know, when you do deals quickly, they tend not to be great deals. But if you take your time and you plan them carefully, actually, you can find some great opportunities. And certainly in the FE space, you know, I've been involved in a couple of mergers where they started off looking at partnerships. How do we come together more closely to share assets, to share capability, to share infrastructure, and actually coming to realize that they've more in common than they might have had, and therefore coming together on their own terms rather than on other people's terms, much more effective. And then the final area that I would talk about is, you know, back to the LEPs, back to the role of universities in their locality. There's been a lot of focus, I think, over the last number of years about the globalization of higher education. And I think one of the things that the referendum and the EU exit debate has reminded us all is actually there is a real need, particularly outside of London and the South East, for investment in place, and the role that anchor institutions can play in supporting that, I think, through city deals, through smart city initiatives, through skills and research, redevelopment and economic growth, I think is a massive opportunity for institutions right across the UK.
But the opportunities around city deals are very big money involved in some of these, Julie.
They are, and actually, you know, a lot of the focus around city deals is around transport and health and social care and infrastructure. And you know that sitting on the other side of the equation is the skills and the expertise and the talent that you're going to need to attract the industries and be able to deliver on these new technologies and these new innovations. And universities are really, really well placed, I think. You know, universities have got the research base, they've got the high-powered computing capabilities, and they are training the next generation of talent. And so to not be front and center and to making more noise about the important role that the institution can and should be playing in some of these city deals, in the way that Edinburgh, for example, are involved in Scotland, I think is a missed opportunity. And actually, I think it will lead to an underperformance of the deals in the longer term.
I mean, you mentioned the big opportunities in the growing middle classes in China and India, and other people would mention Brazil,
Yep.
and other places. Latin America has always been regarded as in the hands of the USA, but Donald Trump may help the opportunities for some institutions. And we had mention earlier of campuses in Poland. Chris, is there much evidence that institutions are thinking that strategic way outside of the traditional attracting overseas students or having a campus, or new ways of thinking about their market?
Yeah, I think I think the TNE, the transnational education, is growing. I agree with comments that were made earlier. It's not always just about students. It's about profile, and it's about, you know, there's other sort of drivers in terms of marketing within those countries. But also, I mean, that provision itself is important, and those partnerships are important. So I think that's something. I think there's sort of challenges at the moment about, making sure that that is seen as good quality provision and all the rest of it. But I think that probably is something that's an important part of it. Just want to come back to the regional stuff. I mean, it's not just about the city deals, there's sort of devolution and then you've got the sort of local economic growth agendas, and we've had the sort of regional science innovation audits and that kind of stuff. And I think you were talking about universities needing to get involved in the sort of metro mayors or city mayor stuff, but I think also we shouldn't underestimate that across other sort of regional and local initiatives, it's actually the universities that are leading it and driving it, because they're the only ones that have got, well, they've got the skills and capabilities and also the financial clout and experience to be able to do that. So in some regions, if you took the university out of that, there probably isn't that civic leadership there actually. And that's actually quite an important dimension of some of the things we were talking about earlier as well.
The UK's brand that it exports around HE is phenomenally strong, but as soon as you start to get stress and distress and there is some of that creeping into the UK sector, it's really important to try and prevent contagion and damaging that UK HE brand, which then damages your ability to operate overseas and makes that just less attractive. It's really important to keep one eye on how that might play out in the future.
Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, we're already seeing universities in partnership with institutions overseas where they're doing joint degree programs, where they're creating the opportunity. Coventry is a great example where, you can study engineering at Coventry, but you'll go overseas for a period of time, both to study but also for placements and work experience. And I think their ambition is that most of the students will have an international placement at some point, partly why Poland is an attractive proposition. So I think that's one thing. The other one is around your point. We're seeing some universities looking at how do you create a joint degree. So you might get a sort of a double degree program, but actually it does allow you to practice, whether that's teaching or nursing or law. Or accountancy, wherever you might want to be. And I think that is one of the real challenges of building some of these international collaborations, is around actually creating an employability offer that works both in the sort of home market and in the partner market as well.
Chris?
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. And just when you mentioned the white paper, I think that does present an opportunity as well. And we probably shouldn't forget that we do have a strong global brand. We've sort of been in sort of, I guess from a political perspective, it feels like we've been underselling ourselves because of government policy. And there is a real opportunity. I mean, what we've done shows that it's related to the point Julie made, that the post-study work offer is absolutely critical in terms of the attractiveness. And you look at our competitors, and that post-study work offer is more competitive than us, and our position has stagnated. And all of those competitors that have strong post-study work offers have grown. And I just think that we can talk about opportunities for the sector to do other things, but really government policy in this area will be absolutely critical. And it will be a real test, I think, of the government's ambition for the country post-Brexit.
Mary, you want to?
Yeah, so Professor Mary Bishop. Just picking up on that point, I think there's 2 points that I would say. One, yes, huge opportunities, but I think one of the issues with it, and with the HE Commission, we did the Staying Ahead report that was launched in Parliament in September. There we were looking at the fact that Australia has actually overtaken the UK in terms of student numbers, which I think took everybody by surprise, although it's been hovering there for a while. But I think back in my time when I was Director of Learning at the ACCA and complying with 20 regulators around the world, it's huge tensions between those regulators, and what you need to do is very often develop local variants so that you can do a mix and match. It's a hugely complex business management operation that requires a really well-oiled machine, and I think that's one of the challenges. And I think another of the challenges in the longer term is recognising that these emerging markets that provide such fertile ground are actually maturing and are taking back some of that market for themselves. And so in the longer term planning, then recognising where the next opportunity is, so that as that maturity develops, you're not lost then and limited in what you're going to do.
It is quite striking that, I mean, British universities do start from a very, very strong position. Strong in brand, mostly strong in finances, much uncertainty on the horizon, and perhaps a bit of an existential crisis around Brexit and some of our places in the world. But when you look around the system, there really isn't any reason why it shouldn't be able to absorb unexpected changes in policy. It may be more difficult for some than others. If the reports are right, it may be a boost for those that work in science and engineering, and may create some difficulties for those in other areas. But yet, there's enough diversity in British higher education to be able to work its way through that. And there is a huge market out there. Interestingly, working with the people who originally developed the idea of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and their hugely growing middle classes. And you can add into that Turkey, you can add into all these areas where there are now significant middle classes looking for free and safe environments for their young people to study. And although lots of them may have ambitions to repatriate, that ambition may not be shared by all of the middle classes who can afford higher education as opposed to some of the old state programs. So there is a huge market out there, and if on the other side the overseas students' numbers are unlocked and the hostile environment is reduced, I think there could be risks of expansion rather than risks of contraction. Well, as a good Scot, it's my job to remind people that if you want to achieve the best, you should always prepare for the worst. I think my message to universities was, if anything goes wrong, you've no excuses. You're starting from a better place than most people in the world. Use the intelligence that you've got, be prepared, follow the advice of this panel, and you'll have no excuse for anything going wrong. So can I thank you for joining us and thank our online viewers. And the box set of this will be out within a few days, and we'd welcome comments and discussion afterwards. And please feel free to write in and tell us anything we've missed, because that'll be the next programme. So from all of us at Eversheds, with particular thank you to Glenn and his colleagues for hosting us and providing the facilities today, and from Chris and Julie and James and all the participants who've come, thank you very much and see you soon.